They laughed at the janitor's story, until a four-star general entered and called him sir. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the bustling cafeteria of Riverside Community Center in small-town Georgia, casting their familiar harsh glow over the lunch crowd. It was Thursday afternoon, and the usual mix of senior citizens, young mothers with toddlers, and local workers filled the modest space with conversation and the clatter of plastic trays. In the corner, methodically mopping the floor with practiced efficiency, was Frank Castellano. At 72, Frank moved with the deliberate pace of a man whose body had seen better days, but whose work ethic remained unshakable. His gray hair was always neatly combed, his janitor's uniform pressed and clean, and his weathered hands steady as he guided the mop across the linoleum tiles. Frank had been the community center's custodian for nearly 15 years now, since he'd moved to Riverside after his wife Martha had passed. The job didn't pay much, but it kept him busy and gave him purpose. Most people barely noticed him as he went about his duties, emptying trash cans, wiping down tables, restocking paper towels in the restrooms. He was part of the background, as invisible as the walls themselves to most visitors. But Frank didn't mind being overlooked. He'd grown accustomed to it over the years. He found satisfaction in maintaining the cleanliness and order of the place where his community gathered. Every spotless floor, every gleaming surface was his small contribution to making people's days a little brighter. The regular patrons knew him, of course. Mrs. Henderson always thanked him when he emptied the trash near her usual table. Young, Tommy Martinez would wave enthusiastically whenever he saw Frank restocking supplies. But to most people, Frank was simply the janitor, if they thought of him at all. What they didn't know, what Frank never spoke about, were the decades that had shaped him before he'd arrived in Riverside with nothing but a worn duffel bag and a heart heavy with loss. The community center's application had asked for previous employment, and Frank had simply written military service in his careful handwriting. No one had pressed for details, and Frank had been grateful for that. On this particular Thursday, the lunch crowd was livelier than usual. A group of local businessmen had claimed the large round table near the windows. The kind of men who spoke loudly about their accomplishments and seemed to measure their worth by the volume of their voices. There was Rick Thompson, who owned the largest car dealership in town and never let anyone forget it. Beside him sat Dave Mullins, a real estate developer who'd made his fortune during the housing boom and wore his success like a badge of honor. The third man, Jerry Kowalski, ran the local construction company and had opinions about everything, from politics to the proper way to pour concrete. As Frank methodically cleaned tables nearby, he couldn't help but overhear their increasingly boastful conversation. "I'm telling you," Rick was saying, gesturing with his coffee cup, "that deal I closed last month was the biggest in the county's history. $350,000 for a single sale. Not bad for a guy who started with nothing." Dave laughed and leaned back in his chair. "That's impressive, Rick, but you should see the development I'm planning out on Highway 27. 50 homes, each one starting at $500,000. This little town's about to get a lot less little, if you know what I mean." Jerry nodded approvingly. "Success breeds success. That's what I always say. You've got to take risks, make bold moves. Most people are too scared to really go after what they want." As Frank quietly wiped down a nearby table, Rick noticed him and raised his voice slightly, as if performing for an audience. "Take our friend here," Rick said, nodding toward Frank. "I bet he's got some stories, right? What do you say, Frank? Ever done anything exciting in your life?" Frank paused in his cleaning, straightening up slowly. His pale blue eyes met Rick's with quiet dignity. "I've had my share of experiences," he said simply, his voice soft but steady. Dave chuckled. "Come on, Frank. We're talking about real adventures. Here. Big deals, important decisions, life-changing moments. What's the most exciting thing that's ever happened to you?" Frank considered the question for a long moment, his hands resting on the mop handle. The three men watched him with the kind of patronizing attention adults might give to a child telling an imaginary story. "Well," Frank said finally, "I suppose the most memorable day of my career was in a place called An Loc Province, Vietnam. It was April 1972, and I was responsible for the safety of about 800 men during what folks later called the Easter Offensive." Rick's eyebrows rose mockingly. "Vietnam, huh? Let me guess, you were in charge of keeping the mess hall clean?" The other two men laughed, and Frank's expression didn't change. He simply nodded slowly. "Something like that," he said quietly, returning to his mopping. But Dave wasn't ready to let it go. 800 men? Come on, Frank. What were you, some kind of general?" The sarcasm in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. "The North Vietnamese had surrounded our position," Frank continued, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, as if he were describing the weather. "We were outnumbered about 4-1, maybe worse. Communications were spotty, supply lines were cut, and the enemy was closing in from 3 sides. Jerry leaned forward with exaggerated interest. "This is better than a movie. So what happened? Next, General Frank?" "I had to make some difficult decisions," Frank said simply. "The kind that keep you awake at night for the next 50 years. The three men exchanged amused glances. Rick shook his head with a condescending smile. "Frank, buddy, we appreciate a good war story, but come on. You're a janitor in a community center in small-town Georgia. The most strategic decision you make is whether to use pine cleaner or lemon fresh." The laughter that followed was loud and cruel, drawing attention from other tables. Frank absorbed it all with quiet dignity, his weathered face showing neither anger nor hurt, just a deep, patient sadness that spoke of a man who had learned long ago that some people would never understand. "You're right," Frank said softly, returning to his work. "I'm just a janitor." Word of Frank's war story spread through the community center like wildfire. By Friday morning, half the regular patrons had heard some version of the tale, usually embellished with additional mockery. "Did you hear about old Frank claiming he was some kind of war hero?" Rick had told his wife that evening, and she'd shared it with her book club. Dave had regaled his golf buddies with the story over drinks, painting Frank as a delusional old man lost in fantasies of glory. The whispers followed Frank as he went about his duties. He could see it in people's sideways glances, hear it in the way conversations stopped when he entered a room. Some looked at him with pity, others with barely concealed amusement. Mrs. Henderson, who had always been kind to Frank, approached him on Friday afternoon as he was restocking supplies in the supply closet. "Frank, honey," she said gently, "people are talking. Maybe you should be more careful about the stories you tell." Frank looked up from the box of paper towels he was unpacking, his blue eyes clear and calm. "I only told the truth, Mrs. Henderson," he said quietly. She patted his arm with maternal concern. "Of course, dear, but sometimes the truth can be complicated. People don't always understand." Frank nodded slowly. "No, ma'am, they don't." As the weekend approached, Frank continued his work with the same quiet dedication he'd always shown. But now there was something different in the air, a weight of judgment that hadn't been there before. The invisible man had briefly become visible, and not in the way he would have chosen. On Saturday morning, as Frank was setting up chairs for the weekend community breakfast, he overheard 2 teenage volunteers talking near the kitchen. "My dad says the old janitor guy thinks he was some kind of army commander," one of them said with a snicker. "Yeah, my mom heard about it too. She says it's sad when old people start making up stories about their past. Must be lonely or something." Frank continued arranging chairs in perfect rows, his movements methodical and precise. Military precision. If anyone had been paying attention to the way he aligned each chair exactly 18 inches from the table, the way he checked and double-checked his work with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to high standards. But no one was paying that. kind of attention. They saw only what they expected to see. An old janitor doing his job, living in a fantasy world of his own creation. Monday morning brought its usual rhythm to the community center. Frank arrived at 6:30 just as he had every weekday for the past 15 years. He unlocked the building, turned on the lights, and began his opening routine with the same quiet efficiency that had become as reliable as sunrise. The coffee was brewing by 7. The chairs were arranged perfectly in the main room, and the floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Frank took pride in these small details, even if no one else noticed them. By 8 o'clock, the first wave of visitors began to arrive. The morning crowd was different from the lunch bunch, mostly retirees who came for the coffee and conversation, a few young mothers with preschoolers heading to the morning story time, and the occasional community worker stopping by for a quick meeting. Rick Thompson's usual table was empty this morning. He typically didn't show up until lunchtime. But word of Frank's delusions had spread even to the morning crowd. Frank could feel the difference in how people looked at him, the way conversations paused when he walked by. Around 10:30, as Frank was mopping the hallway near the main entrance, he noticed unusual activity outside. A black sedan had pulled up to the curb, followed by another. Men in dark suits were stepping out, moving with the kind of purposeful coordination that spoke of military or government training. Frank paused in his mopping, his trained eye automatically assessing the situation. The lead man was tall and lean, with silver hair and bearing that commanded attention even at a distance. Behind him came 2 younger men, clearly security, their eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Through the glass doors, Frank watched as the group approached the building. The lead man's uniform was partially visible beneath his overcoat, dress blues with ribbons and insignia that Frank's experienced eye could read like a book, even from across the room. The automatic doors opened, and the group entered the community center. The main room, which had been buzzing with quiet conversation moments before, fell silent as every head turned toward the newcomers. The man in the lead was clearly military, not just any military, but high-ranking military. His bearing spoke of decades of command, of decisions made under pressure, of responsibility that most people couldn't imagine. The ribbons on his chest told a story of service spanning multiple conflicts and continents. Frank recognized the rank. Insignia immediately, 4 stars, a full general, the kind of officer who commanded entire theaters of operation, who briefed presidents and shaped the course of history. The general's eyes swept the room with practiced efficiency, taking in the layout, the people, the atmosphere. His gaze paused briefly on each face before moving on until it reached Frank, still standing in the hallway with his mop. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the 2 men looked at each other across the crowded room. Frank's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the mop handle. The general's expression shifted subtly, recognition dawning in his eyes. "Excuse me," the general said to the room at large, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people listen without question. "I'm looking for Frank Castellano." Every eye in the room turned toward Frank. The whispered conversation stopped entirely. Even the staff members who had been bustling around the kitchen doorway froze in place. Frank straightened slowly, setting the mop aside with careful precision. "I'm Frank Castellano," he said, his voice steady despite the sudden attention. The general walked across the room with measured steps, his security detail maintaining their positions near the entrance. As he approached, the crowd seemed to part instinctively, creating a clear path between the 2 men. When the general reached Frank, he stopped exactly 3 feet away, military courtesy distance, and came to attention with the kind of precision that spoke of a lifetime of service. Then, to the absolute astonishment of everyone watching, the 4-star general rendered a perfect military salute. "Colonel Castellano," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "Sir." The word "sir" hung in the air like a thunderclap. Frank, after a moment's hesitation, returned the salute with the same crisp precision, his 72-year-old body moving with the muscle memory of command. "General Morrison," Frank replied quietly, recognition evident in his voice. "It's been a long time." The general held the salute for the full formal duration before dropping his hand. "Not nearly long enough to forget what you did for my men. At Anlock, sir." A collective gasp went through the room. Mrs. Henderson's coffee cup clattered against her saucer. Rick Thompson, who had just entered for his usual pre-lunch visit, stood frozen in the doorway, his mouth hanging open. "I was a captain then," General Morrison continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. "3rd Company, 196th Infantry. Do you remember, sir?" Frank's weathered face showed the first hint of emotion he'd displayed in days. "I remember all of you, son. Every single one." General Morrison turned slightly, addressing the crowd that had gathered to listen, though his words were clearly intended for Frank. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute truth, "you are in the presence of one of the finest military commanders this nation has ever produced. Colonel Frank Castellano, recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with oak leaf cluster, and the Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters." The silence in the room was deafening. Frank remained standing quietly, neither confirming nor denying the general's words, his expression modest and dignified. "Colonel Castellano," the general continued, "commanded the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment during the Easter Offensive of 1972. When An Loc Province was surrounded by 3 full divisions of North Vietnamese regulars, it was Colonel Castellano who held the line. Rick Thompson had gone pale, his usual bluster completely deflated. Dave Mullins, who had arrived moments earlier expecting to continue yesterday's mockery, stood speechless near the coffee station. For 72 hours, General Morrison's voice grew stronger. While outnumbered 4-1, while cut off from supply lines and communications, Colonel Castellano coordinated the defense of An Loc. He saved not just the 800 men under his direct command, but prevented a strategic breakthrough that could have changed the entire course of the war in that region. Frank's hands, which had been steady on the mop handle moments before, now trembled slightly. The weight of memories, carefully contained for decades, seemed to settle on his shoulders like a familiar heavy cloak. "I was 23 years old," General Morrison continued, his voice now tinged with emotion. "A scared captain with a company of boys who were barely old enough to vote. When the orders came to retreat, when command told us to fall back and leave An Loc to the enemy, it was Colonel Castellano who made the decision to stay." The general paused, looking directly at Frank. He looked at me and said, "Son, these people are counting on us. We don't leave." "And we didn't leave, sir, because you didn't leave." Tears were now visible in the eyes of several people in the room. Mrs. Henderson was dabbing at her face with a tissue. Even some of the younger staff members, who had only known Frank as the quiet custodian, were visibly moved. "The North Vietnamese threw everything they had at us," the general continued. "Artillery, mortars, human wave attacks. For 3 days and 2 nights it never stopped. But Colonel Castellano, he was everywhere, coordinating fire support, rallying the men, making the impossible decisions that kept us alive." Frank finally spoke, his voice soft but clear. "You boys did the fighting. I just tried to point you in the right direction." General Morrison shook his head firmly. "Sir, with respect, you did far more than that. When Captain Williams' company was overrun on the north perimeter, you personally led the counterattack. When our radio operator was killed and we lost contact, with fire support, you crawled 200 meters under enemy fire to establish communications." The room was so quiet that the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed loud. Every person present was hanging on every word. understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. And when the supply drop went wrong, the general's voice grew thick with emotion, when those medical supplies landed in no man's land between our lines and theirs, it was you who went out to get them, alone, in broad daylight. Because Private Morrison, my little brother, was bleeding out in a foxhole, and those supplies were the only thing that could save him. The general's voice broke slightly on the last words. You brought back those medical supplies, sir, and you saved my brother's life. Frank's composure finally cracked, just slightly. A single tear made its way down his weathered cheek as he looked at the general with new understanding. Danny Morrison, he said softly. Little Danny Morrison from Ohio. He made it? He made it, sir. 30 years as a federal judge. Retired. Last year with grandchildren who'll never know how close they came to never existing. General Morrison's voice was steady now, but full of profound gratitude. Because of you, sir. The general reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, worn photograph. He handed it to Frank with both hands, like a sacred offering. The 3rd Battalion, Anlock, April 1972, he said. Every man in this picture went home because of your leadership, sir. Every single one. Frank looked down at the photograph, his hands trembling as he held it. The faces looking back at him were young, dirty, exhausted, but alive. Behind them, barely visible in the background, was Frank himself, 30, years younger, but with the same steady eyes, the same quiet strength. I've carried that picture for 51 years, General Morrison said, through every assignment, every promotion, every command, because I never wanted to forget what real leadership looks like. Rick Thompson, who had been standing frozen near the door throughout this entire exchange, finally found his voice. It came out as barely more than a whisper. Frank. Colonel, I'm so sorry. We didn't know. We couldn't have known. Frank looked up from the photograph, his composure restored. His voice was gentle, without a trace of anger or resentment. There was no way you could have known, Rick. I never told anyone. Dave Mullins stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. But why? Why didn't you ever say anything? All these years we've treated you like a janitor, Frank finished quietly. Which is what I am. This job, this place, these people, they're my life now. What happened 50 years ago in a jungle on the other side of the world? That was a different life, a different man. General Morrison shook his head. Sir, with respect, that man is still here. I can see him. The same courage, the same quiet strength, the same dedication to service. You've been taking care of people here just like you took care of your soldiers then. Colonel, General Morrison continued, straightening to his full height. I didn't come here just to reminisce. I came here on official business. He nodded to one of his aides, who stepped forward carrying a wooden box with brass fittings. The aide opened the box with ceremony, revealing a medal nestled in blue velvet, the Distinguished Service Cross, America's second highest military decoration. 51 years ago, the general announced to the assembled crowd, Colonel Frank Castellano was recommended for the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions at Anlosu. Due to the classified nature of the operation and the chaos of that time, the recommendation was lost in the bureaucracy. Frank's eyes widened slightly. This was clearly news to him. 6 months ago, when I was appointed to review historical military records, I found that recommendation in a dusty file cabinet at the Pentagon. It was signed by every surviving officer, who served under you, sir, including then Captain Morrison. That's me. The general lifted the medal from its case. While we cannot retroactively award the Medal of Honor without an act of Congress, it is my privilege to present you with the Distinguished Service Cross, along with a formal apology from the United States Army for the 51-year delay. The presentation that followed was conducted with full military honors, despite the humble setting of the community center. General Morrison read the official citation, his voice carrying clearly through the room. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations involving conflict with an armed hostile force. Colonel Frank Castellano, distinguished, himself by exceptionally valorous actions during the period 5/8 April 1972, while serving as battalion commander during the defense of An Loc Province, Republic of Vietnam. As the citation continued, detailing Frank's actions with military precision, the people in the room began to understand the true magnitude of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a war story. This was history. And the man who had been, mopping their floors for 15 years, was a genuine American hero. When the general pinned the medal to Frank's janitor's uniform, the incongruity was stark, but somehow perfect. The highest military honor, presented in a small-town community center, pinned to the uniform of a man who had chosen service over recognition, humility over glory. The formal ceremony concluded, but General Morrison wasn't finished. He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher addressing students. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said. "What Colonel Castellano did in Vietnam was extraordinary by any measure, but what he's done here, in this community, for the past 15 years is equally remarkable." He gestured around the immaculate community center. "This man has served his country on battlefields, and now he serves his community in this building. The same dedication, the same attention to detail, the same quiet leadership. Military service takes many forms, but service to others is the common thread." Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Frank, honey, why didn't you ever tell us?" Frank's response was characteristically humble. "Mrs. Henderson, what happened over there was my job. What happens here is my choice. I'd rather be known for the choice." Rick Thompson approached hesitantly, his usual swagger completely absent. "Colonel, sir, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. The things we said, the way we laughed." Frank held up a gentle hand. "Rick, you don't owe me anything. You saw a janitor telling an unbelievable story. Your reaction was human nature." "But we were wrong," Dave Mullins added, his voice thick with emotion. "So completely, horribly wrong." "You were wrong about the details," Frank agreed quietly, "but you weren't wrong about who I am today. I am a janitor. I mop floors and empty trash cans and restock supplies. That's not a lesser thing. It's just a different thing." General Morrison nodded approvingly. "That, ladies and gentlemen, is what real leadership sounds like. No ego, no bitterness, no need for recognition. Just service, in whatever form it takes." In the days that followed, word of the ceremony spread throughout Riverside and beyond. Local news stations picked up the story, then regional outlets, and finally national news. "Small Town Discovers Hero in Plain Sight" became a viral story, shared millions of times across social media. But for Frank, life returned to its familiar rhythm surprisingly quickly. He still arrived at 6:30 every morning, still brewed the coffee and arranged the chairs with military precision. The only visible change was the small display case that the community center board had installed near the main entrance, containing Frank's medals and a brief description of his service. The real changes were more subtle. People looked at Frank differently now, not with pity or condescension, but with respect and genuine affection. Conversations included him rather than happening around him. Children who visited the center with their parents would wave enthusiastically and call out, "Hi, Colonel Frank." Rick Thompson became one of Frank's most vocal supporters, using his car dealership's advertising budget to sponsor a small scholarship fund for local veterans. Dave Mullins quietly arranged for all of Frank's home maintenance needs to be handled, free of charge, by his company. Jerry Kowalski started a tradition of bringing Frank coffee every morning, along with genuine conversation about everything from construction techniques to military history. Mrs. Henderson, who had always been kind, to Frank, now made it her mission to ensure he was properly cared for. She organized the other regulars to take turns bringing him home-cooked meals, despite his gentle protests that it wasn't necessary. "Frank," she told him one afternoon as she presented him with a still warm apple pie, "you spent 50 years taking care of other people. It's our turn to take care of you." 3 months after General Morrison's visit, the community center hosted a Veterans Day ceremony. Frank had been asked to speak, and though he initially declined, the gentle persistence of his friends eventually convinced him to share a few words. Standing at the small podium, looking out at the packed room, Frank spoke with the same quiet authority that had once commanded a battalion in combat. "People ask me why I never talked about Vietnam," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "The truth is, for most of us who served, war isn't something you talk about. It's something you carry. You carry the weight of the decisions you made, the friends you lost, the responsibility you bore." He paused, his eyes moving across the familiar faces in the crowd. "But I've learned something these past few months. Carrying that weight alone doesn't honor the memory of those who didn't come home. Serving in silence doesn't inspire the next generation to serve. Sometimes, sharing your story is another form of service." Frank's voice grew stronger as he continued. "Every person in this room serves in their own way. Teachers serve by educating our children. Nurses serve by caring for the sick. Business owners serve by providing jobs and supporting the community. Parents serve by raising the next generation with love and values." He looked directly at Rick, Dave, and Jerry, who were sitting in the front row. "And sometimes we serve just by treating each other with kindness and respect, by looking beyond the surface to see the person underneath, by understanding that everyone has a story worth hearing, even if they choose not to tell it." The applause that followed was long and heartfelt, but Frank raised his hand gently to quiet it. "I have one more thing to say," he continued. "To the young people here today, understand this. Heroism isn't about being the strongest or the loudest or the most famous. It's about doing what's right when no one is watching. It's about serving others before serving yourself. It's about getting up every day and doing your job with dignity and pride, whether that job is commanding a battalion or mopping a floor." Frank stepped back from the podium, then added quietly, "And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, you get to do both." A year later, Frank Castellano was still the custodian at Riverside Community Center. His morning routine remained unchanged. Arrive at 6:30, turn on the lights, brew the coffee, arrange the chairs with military precision. But now, those small acts of service were understood for what they truly were: the continuation of a lifetime dedicated to taking care of others. The community center had become something of a pilgrimage site for military families and veterans from across the region. They came not to gawk at a celebrity, but to meet a man who embodied the quiet dignity of service. Frank welcomed them all with the same humble grace, never seeking attention but never turning away those who needed to see that heroism could wear a janitor's uniform. General Morrison visited twice more that year, always without fanfare, always treating Frank with the deep respect due a superior officer. On his last visit, he brought his brother Danny, the former Private Morrison whose life Frank had saved at Anlock. Danny, now a distinguished retired judge, wept openly as he shook Frank's hand. "I've lived 51 extra years because of you, sir," Danny Morrison said. "Married my college sweetheart, raised 3 children, saw them have children of their own. Every birthday, every Christmas, every graduation, every wedding, all of it possible because of what you did in that jungle." Frank's response was characteristically humble. "You made good use of that time, son. That's all any of us can do." The story of Frank Castellano became more than just a viral news item. It became a teaching tool used in leadership courses at military academies, in business schools, and in community organizations across the country. The lesson was always the same. True leadership doesn't require recognition, and genuine heroism often goes unnoticed until someone cares enough to look closer. Rick Thompson kept a framed photograph of Frank on his office wall, not the young Colonel in his dress uniform, but Frank in his janitor's coveralls, mop in hand, American flag pin on his collar. Real success, Rick would tell his salespeople, isn't about how much money you make or how famous you become. It's about how you serve others when no one is watching. Dave Mullins changed his company's motto to Service First, Profit Second, and instituted a policy of providing free home repairs for elderly veterans. Jerry Kowalski started a youth mentorship program, pairing successful tradesmen with young people who needed guidance and opportunity. As this story draws to a close, Frank Castellano continues his quiet work at the Riverside Community Center. He still arrives early, still maintains the building with meticulous care, still treats every visitor with dignified respect. The difference is that now, people understand the depth of character behind the humble exterior. Children who visit the center learn that heroes come in all forms, sometimes in dress uniforms with ribbons and medals, sometimes in work clothes with mops and brooms. Parents point to Frank as an example of what true service looks like, explaining that the most important work is often the work that no one notices until it's gone. The Thursday lunch crowd still gathers at their usual table, but the conversation has changed. Instead of boasting about their achievements, they often find themselves discussing ways to serve their community better. Frank sometimes joins them during his break, sharing quiet wisdom earned through decades of leading others and serving something greater than himself. Mrs. Henderson, now in her 80s, still brings Frank apple pies and home-cooked meals. "Frank," she told him recently, "you taught this whole town what it means to be a hero. Not the kind in movies, but the real kind. The kind that shows up every day and does what needs doing." Frank's response, as always, was humble. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm just glad to be useful." The medals in the display case have become a symbol not just of Frank's military service, but of the recognition that every community should give to those who serve quietly and faithfully. School groups visit regularly, and Frank always takes time to answer their questions, teaching them that honor isn't about glory. It's about doing your duty with integrity and compassion. The story of Frank Castellano serves as a powerful reminder that heroism walks among us every day, often in the most humble disguises. In a world that celebrates celebrity and worships fame, Frank's story calls us back to the fundamental truth that real worth is measured not by recognition received, but by service given. Every community has its Frank Castellanos, quiet individuals, who serve faithfully without seeking reward, who lead by example rather than by proclamation, who understand that true honor comes from lifting others up rather than elevating oneself. They are the teachers who stay late to help struggling students, the nurses who hold hands with frightened patients, the volunteers who show up week after week without fanfare. They are also the people we might overlook, the janitors and groundskeepers, the food service workers and security guards, the countless individuals who maintain the infrastructure of our daily lives with dignity and pride. Frank's story challenges us to look beyond surface appearances, to recognize that every person we encounter carries within them the capacity for greatness. The transformation of Riverside's community center from a place where a hero was mocked to a place where service is celebrated represents the transformation that can happen in any community when people choose to see beyond stereotypes and assumptions. It reminds us that respect should be given freely, that kindness costs nothing, and that every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their position or appearance. General Morrison's final words to the community that day perhaps said it best. Colonel Castellano reminds us that service is not a job description, it's a way of life. Whether you're commanding a battalion or mopping a floor, the question isn't what you do, but how you do it. And Frank Castellano has shown us all how to do it right. As we consider Frank's story, we might ask ourselves, what assumptions do we make about the people around us? What stories remain untold because we never think to ask? What quiet heroes walk among us, serving faithfully while we look past them in search of more obvious forms of greatness. Frank Castellano chose to find meaning in service, dignity in honest work, and satisfaction in making others' lives a little better. In a world that often seems to value only the loud and the famous, his quiet example reminds us that the most profound impact often comes from the most humble service. The next time you encounter someone in a service role, the person cleaning your office building, serving your coffee, or maintaining your community spaces, remember Frank's story. Remember that you might be in the presence of greatness, wearing work boots and carrying a mop. Remember that every person has a story worth respecting, even if they choose not to tell it. And perhaps most importantly, remember that heroism isn't reserved for battlefields or emergency rooms. It's available to anyone willing to serve others with dignity, integrity, and quiet dedication to something greater than themselves. Frank Castellano's story isn't just about a decorated war hero working as a janitor. It's about the choice to find purpose in service, to maintain dignity in any honest work, and to understand that true leadership doesn't require a title or recognition. It simply requires showing up day after day and doing what needs to be done with excellence and compassion. In the end, Frank got it right from the beginning. He understood that who you are matters more than what you've done, that how you treat people today is more important than the accolades you earned yesterday, and that real heroes don't need to announce themselves. They just need to serve. The next time someone tells you an incredible story, the next time you encounter someone in a humble job, the next time you're tempted to judge based on appearances, remember the janitor who was also a colonel and ask yourself, what stories might I be missing? What heroes might I be overlooking? What opportunities for respect and kindness am I walking past every day? Because in the end, we all have the capacity to be heroes. We just need to choose service over self, humility over pride, and quiet excellence over loud mediocrity. We need to choose to be like Frank Castellano, not because he was a decorated war hero, but because he understood that every day is an opportunity to serve others with dignity and grace. That's a lesson worth remembering and a legacy worth continuing. A truly remarkable reminder that heroes and extraordinary kindness can be found in the most unexpected places. What did you find most inspiring about Frank's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever witnessed a moment where someone was revealed to be far more than they seemed, or seen an act of kindness change a life? We'd love to hear about it. Frank Castellano's story teaches us that real heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear janitors, coveralls, and carry mops. Sometimes they've been serving quietly among us all along, waiting not for recognition, but simply for the opportunity to continue making others' lives better. If stories like this warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity, please give this video a thumbs up, subscribe for more, and click the notification bell so you don't miss our next uplifting tale. Remember, every person you meet has a story, and some of those stories might just change how you see the world. Thanks for watching, and remember, true heroism isn't about being seen, it's about serving others, one quiet act of dedication at a time.